Well, thank you, Lynn, and thank you to the Atwater Library for inviting me. Thank you all for coming out here today. I mean, I see a number of familiar faces and some new faces that I hope to meet in the chat after. And I want to say hi to all of the folks who are online. So can we start now, the slideshow? Jason, thanks. He's our technical expert. Very good, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So I'm here today to talk about the new book that I brought out called What We Choose to Forget. This book began as a film, which is the opposite of the more usual situation in which a film begins from a book. What We Choose to Remember was an oral history of the previous half-century. In the 1960s, Quebec was an incredibly exciting place. 50 million people went to Expo 67. There was also a lot of fear in the 60s because of the FLQ, and a lot of anger because of economic and social inequality. The film looked back at the previous half-century as a success story. Unilingual Francophones who formerly earned less than unilingual Anglos now earn more than bilingual Anglos. It used to be hard to work in French, hard to get service in French. Now it is easy. So I launched What We Choose to Remember in May 2022. In June 2022, the Coalition Avenir Quebec government passed Bill 96, claiming that French was in free fall, and if aggressive action was not immediately taken, Quebec would quickly become Louisiana. That surprised a lot of Anglophones and Allophones. Normally, a documentary film travels to film festivals nationally and internationally, but my film was about Quebec, and I wanted to show the film in Quebec. So I started making it available to different communities, and the response was extraordinary. Between the launch in May 2022 and December 2024, which is the period covered by the book, the film was shown in 55 communities all around Quebec. And after every screening, there was a conversation with the audience. And the audiences wanted to talk about their own personal histories, their families. They also wanted to talk about language, and they wanted to talk about politics, especially Bill 96, as it began to affect people in many, many ways. The first screening took place in this town. This is the town where the first English school in Quebec was built in the 1760s. Does anybody know where that was? Well, that in the background behind me in the photo is Percé. This is the Gaspé. And why was the first English school built up there? Because during the 1750s, when the British Army marched from Acadia across to Nouvelle-France, the entire Gaspé Peninsula was depopulated. After the conquest, the region was repopulated by British loyalists from the USA and fishermen and traders from Britain and the Channel Islands. In 1775, Felix O'Hara built what would become the oldest house in Gaspé. Alfred Carter created the Gaspé Coal Company and built a large wharf in 1870 that made the town prosperous. The complex linguistic, ethnic, and religious backgrounds of early settlers are reflected in the bicultural name of the first bishop of the Diocese of Gaspé, François Xavier Ross. At the time of Quebec's, Canada's first census in 1871, the population of Gaspé had reached almost 1,000. One of the things that I do in the book, for every town that I visited, I pulled out the census statistics as far back as they go. The first Canadian census was in 1871, so then I pulled out numbers 50 years later in 1921, 1971, and 2021. And it is really informative about how the French-speaking, English-speaking, and Allophone populations have shifted over time. So we see here that in 1871, Gaspé was 72% English, and that has consistently dropped to 57%, 20%, and 1%. One woman spoke of being born to Anglophone parents who bought a house in a street entirely inhabited by Francophones. To ensure that their daughter mixed with the other children, the father built a playground in the backyard for all the neighborhood children. thereby ensuring that his daughter had friends and that she became fully bilingual. Not all parents have the resources or the vision for such an ambitious solution. Families that raise bilingual children are more likely to remain in the region and prosper, but their identity is not traditionally Anglo, particularly if one parent is Francophone. They have an evolving hybrid identity. One woman told the story of a 5-year-old describing his linguistic identity to his teacher. He said, "My father is English, my mother is French, and I'm a mixed-up kid." The bilinguals I met did not fit into binary boxes, but appeared happy with their mixed identity and confident about their future. The future for Anglos who are unilingual or who have limited French skills is less certain, although their families may have lived in the region for many generations and contributed to its historical development. Young people with limited language skills must leave the region to find work. Unilingualism depletes the community, but bilingualism can deplete the English-speaking community in different ways, creating complex identities with no single linguistic affiliation. Now, the next screening took place here. This was a place I had never been. This is close to the Ontario border in northern Quebec. The rugged Canadian Shield has a long history of mining: silver, gold, copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare elements. In 1911, Nova Scotian prospector Edmund Henry Horne crossed the Ontario border and entered 40 kilometers into Quebec, where he discovered deposits of silver and staked claims that created Noranda Mines Limited. The company would eventually employ 32,000 people and amass assets in excess of $11 billion. So this is downtown Rouyn-Noranda. The mine is right in the middle of the town, which makes it great for commuters, but it's not so good for polluters. They have a lot of problem there with the cleanliness of the air. If we look at, originally Rouyn-Noranda was two different towns. One was Rouen, which was mostly French, and the other was Noranda, which was the company town, mostly English. And the first census there in 1941 shows that 33% of the city's population were French. The other 67% were English and allophone. By 71, that had changed dramatically. Rouen was always much more French than English. When they merged in the 70s, it became predominantly French, and now the population is 96% French, 2% English, and 2% allophone. I met a war bride who arrived in Noranda in 1946. Back then, she said, "The town was so English, we might as well have been living in Ontario." Noranda had a daily English newspaper with a circulation of 3,000 copies. Now the entire English-speaking population has fallen below 1,000. From the 1930s to the 1970s, Rouyn-Noranda was also home to a significant Jewish population. A few months before my visit, a group of ex-residents published a book about the Jewish history of Rouyn-Noranda. They were merchants, doctors, and professionals who drifted away during Quebec's years of national affirmation and political turmoil. Most visitors would have no reason to suspect that Rouyn-Noranda built its airport on the site of a village founded by David McWaters, who discovered a gold mine there in 1932. The town of McWaters became a haven for Protestant immigrants, including the parents of a young man named Jimmy Hines. He was born in 1935 and changed his name to Jimmy James, and he became a popular country and western singer who had hit singles on the American charts at the same time as Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley. Jimmy James divided his time between Nashville and Rouyn-Noranda, where he hosted a popular TV show called Jamboree and another one called Ranch 4. His wife, Linda Lee, whose family migrated to Abitibi from the USA, grew up in the adjacent Anglo village of Farnborough, and she was also a popular singer. So we headed to these screenings in Le Petit Théâtre, which was recently renovated. It's a beautiful place. It's a beautiful center. But it was originally called, as you see on the right, Remembrance Hall. It was built in 1948. After the screening, a woman in the audience spoke at length about her family's multi-generational journey, which echoed experiences shared by many first-wave immigrants. Her ancestors arrived in Quebec in the 1840s, and they settled in the eastern townships, until her grandparents moved to Noranda in the 1930s to work in the mines. She was educated in English, and most of her friends were English speakers. Being identified as an Anglo had been a distinct disadvantage when she was a child, during the first referendum and a young parent during the second referendum. Like most Anglos, she made considerable efforts to improve her French. She married a Francophone, sent her kids to French school, but she spoke mostly English at home so that her children would be bilingual. As in most bilingual families, the children's language skills differ greatly. Each child makes different friends, plays different sports, and has a different relationship with their parents. It is extremely difficult to attain mother tongue competence in 2 languages, so most children will be stronger in one. A child who is weak in French or has a pronounced English accent will find it harder to succeed in Quebec and is more likely to relocate to an English-speaking province or a country where bilingualism will be valued. The Ontario border is just a few kilometers west of Rouyn-Noranda. Most of the people at the screening remembered the 1960s, the FLQ, the election of the Parti Québécois, Bill 101, the 1980 referendum, the failed Meat Lake Accord, the failed Charlottetown Accord, and the brutally divisive 1995 referendum. During the years of tension and turmoil, large numbers of Anglos and allophones relocated to Montreal or left Quebec altogether. The pioneering role of departed Anglo families is being forgotten by the Francophone majority. What I have just described would become the first chapter of the book, although at that point, I had no idea that I would spend the next 2 years traveling around Quebec and would visit almost every region in Quebec. So what stands out for you in this map? Well, one thing that stands out, if you ignore the words, is waterways. And one thing that became clear when I was touring around Quebec was that the oldest settlements are built on water. That was the best way to travel. So first, the St. Lawrence Valley was populated all along the shores. Then the tributaries, so the Ottawa River was populated. So this town here called St. Andre, sort of in a lower left-hand corner, used to be called St. Andrews. And it was the birthplace of Canada's second Prime Minister. Remember? Sir John Abbott. So that was a very popular Scottish town. Going up La Rivière du Nord, you come to Brownsburg, very English town, La Chute, which had a large English population. And a few miles up was St. Columban, which was the oldest Irish settlement in Quebec, settled in 1810. While visiting La Chute to show my film, I arrived early and walked down the broad Rue Principale lined with early 20th century commercial buildings. Driving along the main street, you might not notice the names of the cross streets: Fraser, Clyde, Water, Bellingham. I saw several churches, the Margaret Rodgers Memorial Presbyterian Church and St. Simeon's Anglican Church. Because of the declining population, the La Chute United Church has sold the large building it once owned and now occupies shared premises in a repurposed funeral home, which cast the La Chute screening in a somber light. The half-dozen people who came to see the film were old enough to have personally witnessed events beginning in the 1960s. I asked how much of the town was English when they were young. They were still 25% English, and they remembered that the 2 communities got on quite well. One woman at the screening had grown up a few miles away at Brownsburg. It was different there, she said. All the families on the west side of the river were English, except for one. The French lived on the other side. She said, I never really learned to speak French, although I got good marks in school. The French and English didn't associate much, but we all went to the arena to skate and to Nadon's restaurant to smoke cigarettes. After the screening, I paid a visit to Brownsburg. Street names on the west side of La Rivière du Nord are still English: Woodland, Greenwood, Elmwood, Rosedale, Hillcrest, while the names on the east side are still French: Saint-Joseph, Saint-Louis, Saint-Georges, de l'Église, et du Couvent. The next layer of settlements came with railways and bridges. So on the south shore of Montreal, in 1860, it opened up access year-round to the south shore, and the first station across the bridge is St. Lambert. It became a prosperous town, and it developed the first immersion school in 1965. Pierre Laporte was living in St. Lambert in 1970 when he was kidnapped by the FLQ. The people at the St. Lambert screening shared a lot of fascinating stories. St. Lambert is sometimes referred to as the West Mount of the South Shore. The president of Air Canada, Michael Rousseau, lives in St. Lambert. A man at the St. Lambert screening shared a story about one of his first jobs working for the King's Transfer van lines, created by the Irish O'Donnell family in Griffintown. When other workers from Griffintown and Point St. Charles asked where he lived on the South Shore, he would always say, "I'm from the park," which meant Greenfield Park. But he was actually from St. Lambert, and he didn't want to mention it because it was perceived as the Westmount of the South Shore, Anglo and wealthy. Commuter access from the South Shore for less wealthy families became possible after 1912, when the Montreal and Southern Counties Railway laid 80 miles of track from Old Montreal to Chambly on the Richelieu River. The names of the stations in this farming territory were highly evocative: Sunlight City, Highland Gardens. If you were to trace a line on a map from the Victoria Bridge to Chambly, you would still find neighborhoods named Greenfield Park, Springfield Park, and Castle Gardens, although they have been absorbed in the expanding suburbs of Longueuil. The Montreal and Southern Counties Railway gave the South Shore quick year-round access to the island, enabling working-class Montrealers to escape crowded urban jungles for fresh air, green fields, and parks. The names of the new development evoked paradise. The reality was somewhat different. As John Riley explained in The History of Greenfield Park, jerry-built houses along unpaved streets were modest and working class, sometimes barely shacks. Some of the neighborhoods, like Greenfield Park, were British and Protestant. Others, like East Greenfield, were Irish and Catholic. V.M. Manning remembered them as a working-class conclave. Land in East Greenfield was sold for building lots to people from Montreal, a great many of them from Point St. Charles, because of the Montreal and Southern Counties Railway. Most of them worked in the Point, as they called it. Others worked for Northern Electric, which was in the area. All were English-speaking, a great many Irish. Manning remembered, "In 1916, my father was working at the Grand Trunk Railway shop in Point St. Charles. One of his workmates wanted to join the army as the First World War was raging in Europe. This man had bought some land on the South Shore, and having no use for it, he sold it to my father. The land was inspected by my parents, some building material was bought, and a small shack with a flat roof was built. We lived there while a 7-room house was built to house the growing family of 3 boys and 1 girl. This was the first lonely house on that side of the track. The subdivision was called Upper Springfield. Across the track was the village of East Greenfield, comprising 30 houses and shacks, mostly shacks." That was his opinion. So during the 3 years that I was making this tour, I traveled many, many miles by road, by rail, and by air. It gave me a lot of time to think about what I was seeing and to begin writing the book in my head. And by the time I had completed 24 screenings, I could see how the story would be structured around regions. I also knew it would be about people. I mean, there are so very, very many ways of being a Quebecer, of being an Anglo-Quebecer or an Allophone Quebecer. A story that I heard in Rawdon helped me understand Quebec in a new way. There was a man there who teaches workshops for social workers who work with immigrants. And so when he works with these people, he has everybody in the room stand up, and he says, "If you're a first-generation immigrant, sit down." And there's usually some people sit. And he says, "If you're a second-generation immigrant, sit down." And more people sit. And by the time he gets to a third-generation immigrant, most of the people in most North American cities are sitting down. The first time he taught his workshop in Quebec in French, he asked everybody to stand up, and he said, "Okay, if you're a first-generation immigrant, sit down." How many sat down? Second generation. Third generation. You know, most Francophones, their roots go so deep and so far back that they don't even remember when their first ancestors arrived or where they came from. And there's often a confusion to project the inverse onto the English-speaking population. Many people who are considered Anglos were not from the British Isles, and they did not arrive in Quebec speaking English. Prior to Bill 101, Quebec had 4 public education systems based on religion and language. The French Catholic schools accepted only Catholics. They did not accept non-Christians or non-Catholics, even if they were mother tongue Francophones. I'm currently working on a research project in education in Quebec prior to Bill 101. I think I just moved the slide there. Yeah. Prior to Bill 101. It was extremely rare for Jewish students or Greek Orthodox students to be accepted in a French Catholic school. They went to English Protestant schools. The research shows that many Catholic immigrants, particularly Italians, were also denied admission to French Catholic schools, and they were directed to English Catholic schools. So when Francophones hear someone speaking English, and they presume they're a part of a deeply rooted, homogeneous, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant group, they're deeply misunderstanding the history of immigration and education in Quebec. And this subject came up again and again during the tour, and it's a serious part of the book as well. So after every screening, there was a conversation with the audience, and this is really the heart of the book. People who came to see the film were Anglophones, Allophones, and Francophones, and they live in Quebec by choice. They like Quebec's French language and culture, and a unilingual society doesn't feel like home to them. Anglos have not rejected Quebec. They have learned French, despite in many cases having poor instruction at school, particularly if they were educated in the 50s and the 60s. And most of them made sure that their kids got a better foundation in French instruction. Allophones almost invariably learn both languages, as well as retaining their mother tongue. Again, they're not rejecting French, they're adding French to their repertoire of languages. And most of us are happy to learn French and to spend part of our time living in French. But people kept saying, but I don't want to become a unilingual Francophone. I mean, that's just not the agenda. And most of the language indicators, the fear indicators in the CAC regime have been based on a decrease in the number of unilingual Francophones and a decrease in the amount of time spent only speaking in French. I also had quite a few Francophones come to my screenings. A number of them were immigrants from all around the Francophonie. And, they said, this idea that language is going to solve all of the problems in Quebec is a pipe dream. Nationalists argue that if we could all speak French, le vivre ensemble would be totally settled. But immigrants who come here with French as their mother tongue say, no, it's much more complicated than that. It's still difficult getting your international credentials recognized. It's still hard to find a job. It's still hard to find a place you can afford to live in. So I got one hit here. So most of the people that I spoke to who came to the screenings were 40s, 50s, 60s, and up. But I had a chance to visit a number of schools, high schools, cégeps, and universities during the tour. And I devoted an entire chapter in the book to the youth perspective, because I think it's important to sort of be looking forward instead of just looking back to the previous half century. So I was invited to show my film at the French cégep Saint-Jérôme as part of their intercultural week. The group of 30 students were all the Souche Francophones, except for 3 immigrants who came from the Maghreb. I asked the students if they felt that Quebec's French language and culture are threatened. They all nodded quite vigorously. So I asked, what is the threat? The question was too large, and the answer was too self-evident for a response. My question sounded to their ears like, why is climate change a threat? They did not have access to source data, but they trusted their elders, their parents and teachers, who firmly believed that Quebec's French language and culture are endangered. I asked how many of them spoke languages other than French. Half of them raised their hands, including the 3 immigrants. I asked them if they thought that speaking languages other than French was a problem for Quebec. And they said, no, of course not. They all thought they should learn as many languages as possible. Then I asked them if they knew that the current language crisis is largely based on a decline in unilingual Francophones. And they looked at me with a mixture of puzzlement and skepticism. After showing another excerpt from the film featuring the most recent wave of immigrants, I asked about the process of becoming Québécois, transitioning from an outsider to an insider. I asked, how do you define who's Québécois? The students agreed about language. Immigrants have to speak French. So I asked, would a unilingual Anglophone be considered a Québécois? And they could immediately see the implications of following through with their answers, so they didn't answer. They were quite uncomfortable with that. So the verdict was clear that no student who only spoke English was a real Quebecer in their eyes. One student suggested that being born in Quebec should be a criterion, but others, sensitive of their immigrant friends from the Maghreb, thought that the definition had to be broader than that. Many thought that sharing Quebec's culture is important. So I asked, how do you define culture? And do you mean knowing music and literature? Or do you mean knowing history and laws? And who would define what is included in culture? And how would you test for that kind of knowledge? These are difficult questions, but important for a generation that will increasingly live side by side with immigrants. I left Saint-Jérôme feeling hopeful. The students at the Cégep were sensitive, thoughtful, and had a natural inclination to be inclusive. They wanted to protect their language and culture, but were fully open to sharing it with newcomers. Then I visited the 3 English universities, just as the CAC was fixing the problem of too many foreign students who were speaking too much English on the streets of Montreal. In March 2023, rumblings began in the media, denouncing a shocking scandal in education. Le Journal de Quebec reported that the government of Quebec was handing over $200 million to the 3 English universities to subsidize more than 16,000 Canadian and foreign students. Also in the same day, the more strident Journal de Montréal upped the ante and reported that Quebec was devoting $1 billion, which is the Quebec number times 5, to anglicize Montreal. This was the political climate when I visited McGill to speak to students training to become teachers. The first student to speak after this screening was from Ontario. He said, "As soon as I started to think about university, I wanted to come to McGill. Montreal is the coolest place in Canada. I thought after university I would stick around and become a teacher. I did a stage, and the vibe I got in the school was that Quebec is becoming an unwelcoming place. I did French immersion, so I speak French fine, but could I have a future here? It is disappointing because of how cool I thought Montreal was." The second speaker was an international student from China. He said, "This is my second year in Canada, and I also feel Quebec is becoming unwelcoming. When I was finishing high school, Bill 96 was just coming out, but it didn't seem to have any impact on education. I applied to a lot of schools, but when the offer came from McGill, I did some research and I thought it would be okay here. I did not expect the tuition increases and the obligation to take French courses. This will filter out many people who intended to apply." The third speaker was also from Ontario, but with Quebec roots. He said, "My grandmother is Francophone and my grandfather is Anglo. They had a Romeo and Juliet romance back in the 60s. My mother was born here in the 70s. Then the family got transferred to Ontario with the big exodus. I'm the first in my family to come back. I've been here for 7 years now and I love it. I feel at home here and I'm stubborn." So at least he had a positive attitude to the changes. The McGill students understood that a small population of French speakers, surrounded by multiple millions of English speakers, whose language dominates international business, politics, education, entertainment, and tourism, will naturally feel vulnerable. They also understood that Quebec's economy is dependent on immigrants, so it is important to ensure that they learn French. The students who were planning to stay in Quebec already spoke French, or were committed to acquiring the language as soon as possible. The situation felt like a lose-lose proposition to them. They were regarded as a problem if they didn't learn French, but they were still a problem if they did because they were contributing to bilingualism. So the last 3 chapters of the book focus on Montreal, and I return to the idea of waves of immigration. So I did 10 screenings around Montreal in many different parts, and we do look at the geography, but the waves of history are important. In 1760, Montreal was a hamlet. It was a village. We have about 6 buildings in old Montreal that date back to the Nouvelle France era. Everything else that we see in Montreal was built by or in collaboration with immigrants. So the Irish screening was in Point St. Charles at the library. Raymond Jess, who teaches in Concordia's Irish Studies program, came to the screening, and so did Fergus Keyes, who has raised funds for Concordia's Irish Studies program, the largest in the world outside of Ireland. Fergus has led many community organizations. He was the chairman of the board for Centaur Theatre, and he was also spearheading the Black Rock Memorial Project. So Fergus is a pillar in the Irish community. I began the post-screening conversation by asking about local history. Fergus was the first to speak. He said, "Over the years, I have worked with politicians from all the parties and at all levels of the government, and 95% of the Francophone politicians I meet tell me they have an Irish ancestor." Then he told a story about meeting the governor of Granby and mentioning that the city was founded by Irish settlers. When the mayor appeared skeptical, Fergus challenged him to look up the names of the first mayors of Granby, and you'll see for yourself. Fergus and Raymond shared many stories about Irish history. Fergus said the first census in Nouvelle-France contained Irish names. The conversation in Point St. Charles was mostly a celebration of immigrant courage, persistence, and success, but it ended on a bleak note. The Irish community in Montreal has become part of the mainstream and has dispersed all around the city. Much of its unique identity has become diluted and invisible. The Irish in Quebec are still a favorite immigrant group historically, but the living, breathing Irish descendants have become English-speaking aliens. The youngest man at the screening in Point St. Charles said, "Growing up here in the 80s and 90s, I always felt like an outsider, being told, ici on parle français. There was a lot of anger amongst the Francophones in the neighborhood, and I was blamed for it, but I didn't know why. I understand that Francophones feel threatened in North America, and I understand that recent immigrants are struggling to get a foot on the ladder, but it seems shitty that the only people who don't have any rights here are Anglophones. I need a job too." So between 1880 and 1917, 2 million Jews fled the Russian Empire. By 1920, Montreal's Jewish population had exploded to 48,000. During the 1930s, the Jewish community moved further up St. Lawrence Boulevard from Duluth to Bernard and into residential side streets like Saint-Aubin. Most of the students attended Baron-Bing High School. Montreal's Jewish population in the 1930s reached 60,000 people, of which 56% were foreign-born and 95% still had Yiddish as their mother tongue. This is the Montreal of Mordecai Richler, born in 1931 during the zenith of Jewish culture in Quebec. Richler recorded the hard-scrabble life of his parents and the unbridled ambition of his own generation, which included William Shatner, also born in 1931, and Leonard Cohen, born in 1934. Joe King, in his book Baron-Bing to Bagels, Tales of Jewish Montreal, devoted 130 pages to profiles of notable Jewish Quebec politicians, scientists, entrepreneurs, artists, innovators, and philanthropists. The first person to speak after the screening in Côte Saint-Luc pursued the themes of history and institutions. A man said, "I hear people say, why is there a Jewish general hospital? Why do the Jews have a big fancy schmancy hospital? They think it was a gift from the government, but we built it with our own donations because Jewish doctors couldn't find work in Christian hospitals. Legault and his fans need to understand this." A woman added, "We always hear the English are so spoiled, they're the best treated minority in the world. Look at all their schools and hospitals and newspapers and radio stations, while the Francophones outside Quebec have nothing." No one in the room appeared unsympathetic to the plight of Francophones in small communities across Canada. But as one man said, that argument is a distraction. Sure, minority Francophones in the rest of Canada need help to build their institutions, but Anglos in Quebec need protection from our own government that wants to destroy the institutions we have built for centuries. There were several comments about xenophobia. One woman said, "I came here from France after the war, but because I'm Jewish, I had to go to an English school." People don't know that. They disbelieve it when you tell them. The final chapter in the book explores the Italian story. Italians are particularly interesting because they were mostly Catholic and they spoke a Romance language similar to French. Italians were one of the immigrant groups most likely to work in French, to adopt French as their home language, and to marry Francophones. In 1930, 63% of Italians enrolled in French Catholic schools. But by 1970, only 10% of Italians were enrolled in French Catholic schools. So did Italians choose to reject French Quebec and join up with the Anglos for the economic benefits? That was the belief at the time of the St. Leonard crisis in 1969. It was also the belief that motivated the language laws of the 1970s, that immigrants would always choose English if they were not forced to attend French schools. The Italian version of the story is somewhat different. Thousands of former students claim they were denied access to French Catholic schools and were forced to attend English Catholic schools. They wanted to learn French, and most of them did learn French, even if they went to an English school. Half a century later, we are still arguing about this. I've been conducting a research project about the question for the past couple of years, and it is clear that non-Christians and non-Catholics had virtually zero chance of getting into a French Catholic school. In the case of Catholics, I've personally interviewed hundreds of people, and there are testimonials from thousands of Catholics who wanted to enroll in French Catholic schools and were sent to English Protestant schools. I've created 2 interim reports of my research. Last month, I wrote an op-ed that was in the Gazette, got a lot of attention in the English-speaking community. This week, on Monday, I had an op-ed in La Presse, which is the first time there's been a major opening to have this conversation in the French milieu. And I was actually heartened by, of the dozens and dozens of people who contacted me, they had either had that experience of going into a French school, having a complicated life, or having been rejected, and only a couple of people said, I don't believe it. So, once upon a time, almost everybody disbelieved it. So we seem to be making progress there. So what time is it? I want to leave 20 minutes at the end for questions, so... We're good. So this is part of the cover. Now, when making the cover of the book, the image that was in front of mind was fragments, layers, competing messages. So what I wanted was the idea of a billboard with all kinds of old, torn posters stacked upon one another. And we found the perfect billboard on St. Lawrence near the Van Horn overpass at the skate park. And then I did a research of all kinds of iconic images of Quebec history and then sort of stuck them onto the billboard and faded them away. So we have here, and a lot of people have noticed the 5 roses flower. Originally it was 5 roses flower, and then after Bill 101 it became Farine, 5 roses. So you'll see that I've restored the flower and partially deleted the Farine, and a lot of old-time Anglers go, yeah! You'll also see the Patriot flag, which, one of the reasons it has green, white, and red is because the Irish and Italians were on the side. So I put a little Paddy standing behind the Patriot waving an Irish flag. And there's also up there's Jacques Parizeau talking about the ethnic vote. There's down here, on va les avoir les Anglais. Bottom left is the Simpson sign. That was back when signs were having their S's removed or painted over because of the language laws. This is the bottom. We have Le Québec aux Québécois. The poster there, Maître chez nous, was from the Lesage's Liberal government in the 1960s. That was Maître chez nous. There's also all of the buttons for the yes and no campaigns in 80 and 95. So this is the website for the book. Now, I am selling books here, and we do have print copies, but because this is a community project, I don't want to monetize it. So on this website, you can see, get a link to YouTube to see the film. It's free. All of the research material and education is there. You can view it, or you can download the reports. I've got 2 on file. There'll be 2 more coming up later this year. And the book, the electronic versions, PDF, and the EPUB version are available for download on the website. So, some people like books. Personally, I like books. I like to turn the pages. But, the story is available for anybody who wants it. And additionally, I highly recommend the PDF copy because it has hundreds of hyperlinks that share music, films, pieces of history, news articles. So if you're really digging deeper into one of these stories, or one of these neighborhoods, it will really enhance your reading of the book. So I'm going to stop here. I'm hoping that you have some questions.